my elementary school was right across the street from the beautiful building that I lived in, and the junior high as well. But when I was about 9 or 10 years old, all of a sudden I was forbidden to go to that school because I would have contaminated with my presence the pure Aryan students.
Someone tell you that?
The law. They had laws forbidding Jewish children to share schools and activities with the pure Aryan children. We were not allowed to go to a movie, to a restaurant, to hot dog joints, nothing was permitted.
Well, you had lots of other little friends who before that time you played with. How did they react to their own little friend being
They
away?
looked through me.
Suddenly they changed.
Suddenly they changed. They looked through me, yes.
What did your parents say to you about that?
Well, they had the same problem too. My father was a lawyer, and some of his clients didn't show up anymore, And my mother was a concert violinist, and she played in orchestras, and all of a sudden she wasn't welcome.
Which orchestra did you play in?
I
Yeah.
don't know. Budapest Orchestra.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
What year was that? You remember?
1940, I would say 42, 43.
That late. So Europe was at war by then.
Well, before the war. This
Mhm.
started before the war.
Okay, so in the
Yeah.
late 30s,
Yeah.
37, 8.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's right.
Mhm. What did you hear about Hitler and the Nazis? What was the news that you heard?
Well, Hitler, every time he made a speech, it was on the radio and on TV. He was extremely famous, and the Hungarian population, excuse me, was highly anti-Semitic.
Really?
Yes.
Even from the before Hitler showed up.
They always were,
Mhm.
and I tell you the reason. Jewish parents would work 2 jobs to make enough money to educate their children. If you educate children, they do better in life. So they were more successful than their classmates, their neighbors, and this was unforgivable.
Jealousy.
Jealousy. So everybody was jealous at them, and that made them generally hated.
Did you sense that even
Oh, yes.
beforehand? You were.
Yes.
Did you go to a synagogue or your
Well,
parents religious?
My maternal grandfather was religious, and it made him very happy when I went. So I was not religious, I didn't want to go, but to make him happy, because I loved and respected him, he was the most saint-like person I ever knew.
Most what?
Saint-like
Was he?
person. He was a surgeon, and it never mattered to him whether a patient could pay or not. The important thing was to make them well, to help them. He didn't want to discuss his fee. He would say to the patients, if they apologize, I won't be able to pay for you now, I have no money. I don't want to hear this. My payment is going to be the fact that you'll be here to be supportive to your family, raise your children, you know?
Were you bat mitzvah?
I think it happened, but I can barely remember it. It wasn't as important as when it happened to a boy.
Yeah.
I remember much better the bar mitzvahs that I attended.
Yeah. So do you have brothers and sisters then?
Well, I had a brother, he died 4 days before his 20th birthday. He committed suicide.
I'm sorry.
during the war, and that hit my family rather badly. It's the one thing you can never get over, because you keep kicking yourself and blaming yourself for not having stopped it. You should have known, you should have seen the symptoms.
Well, people do that for a variety of reasons. Do you think the war or
It
had
had a
something-
lot to do with it. He went into hiding with false identity,
Mhm.
and he got a job working with a as a police officer under a false name.
Mhm.
My father spent half his life savings buying him false identity papers, and the other half buying them for me. I was sent to live on a farm where I milked a goat and fed a pig. I stayed there for
With a-
about a year and a half.
With a false identity paper.
False identity. I could prove my pure Aryan heritage going back, I think, 4 generations. You
Does
had
that
to
mean-
do that.
Does that mean that some people, like the farmer, who probably knew, were protective of Jews?
Well, that was an interesting situation. The farmer, it so happened, was a patient whose life my grandfather saved, and he needed very serious surgery. I don't know whether it was his appendix that broke or what, but he needed major surgery. And he said to my grandfather before the surgery, "Sir, I'm so sorry, but I have to be honest with you and tell you, I can't afford to pay you. I have no money." And my grandfather said to him, "I don't want to hear about that. My payment is going to be that you get well and you're able to raise your children
Mm-hmm.
and enjoy your family. Don't talk to me about money." So the man kept saying, "Well, I'll pay you back someday. I promise you that I will." 30 years went by, and 30 years later, on the very day that the newspaper article was published that everybody Jewish had to move into a ghetto and report for it, and lots of other things too. My grandfather's doorbell rang, and this patient whose life he saved, who never paid him, stood at the door and said, "Sir, you saved my life 30 years ago, and I told you I'd pay you someday.
Wow.
I'm here to do it today."
Wow.
I wrote away for my family's papers going back 4 generations and told my neighbors that my uncle and aunt who live in the country are coming to stay with me, and I'll introduce you as them. I want you and your wife to stay with me from now on. My grandparents moved in with them, and it saved their lives.
And your father and mother?
No, that was a different story. My father was a World War I military hero.
Mm-hmm.
He had a huge picture frame, which Nigel has now, with 5 big medals that he won, and one of them was the famous German Iron Cross.
Oh, really?
And that gave him a special status. Bless you! That made him a military exception.
Let me understand. So was this like in the old Austro-Hungarian empire that he somehow, a Hungarian got the German military cross, or how did he?
Well,
He was part of the Axis troops.
Well, World War
During
I.
World War
Yeah.
One?
During
Okay.
World War One,
Okay,
Austria-Hungary were one country,
yeah,
and they and Germany were on the same side of the war,
okay.
fighting you guys.
Yeah.
Sorry to say that.
Mhm. Okay, so.
And then when World War II broke out, the same thing happened again.
Yeah, but so your mother and father, though your grandparents were able to go to the farm and you too went there
My
temporarily.
grandparents went to the farm with false identity, and then they included me too.
Mhm.
And I milked the goat and fed the pig for about a year and a half.
Mhm.
And my name was not Anna Veronica Berend, which my maiden name used to be.
Mhm.
It was Aranka Molnar. Aranka, Arankoka, Aranka. Molnar, the last name, Molnar.
Hmm.
That became my name, and
How old were you at that point, do you think?
I think I was 11,
11.
something like that.
And did you understand why you were
Yes,
on the run? Were
I
people being
understood.
picked up and taken away by that time?
Yes, I understood, and I had an allergic reaction to being humiliated, and I was incredibly humiliated for being Jewish, which I couldn't tolerate. And when the law came out that anybody who was not just Jewish, but had one Jewish relative going back 4 generations,
Mhm.
was considered a no good goddamn Jew who didn't deserve to be alive and live there, we had to wear a yellow Mogen David, if you know what that is.
Mhm.
And it had to be right here over our hearts, on the left side of the chest. And I was too ashamed and embarrassed to go out wearing it. I never went out. After I stayed indoors for a number of weeks, all of a sudden I felt conscience stricken. I wanted to visit my grandparents because my grandfather was sick. So for the first time, I went out into the street wearing this. And
She's the best customer I have.
so anyhow, I went out wearing this, and it was the first time I walked in the street with the yellow, canary yellow Mogen David. That's what they called it. And as I walk in the street, all of a sudden I can't walk further. Somebody is blocking my way, and it's an old man. When I say old man, I was 11, and he was not much older than my son, but he seemed like an old man to me. And he blocked my way, wouldn't let me walk. And all of a sudden he said to me, "You little Rose of Sharon." And with that, he spits into my face.
What does that mean?
Rose of Sharon?
Mhm.
It's somebody who's from Israel, who's Jewish.
Mhm.
Rose of Sharon.
Mm.
I don't know, but it
Mhm.
was a Jewish expression, you know.
Mhm.
And he bent towards me and he spat into my face. To this day, I don't remember what you told me 5 minutes ago, but I remember this. His spittle hit me in the left eye, it dribbled down into my mouth, and I went berserk. I started to scream. I ripped off the yellow star, I threw it in his face, and I ran home screaming. And I said to my father was sitting with a client, he was a lawyer advising him, and I barged into the office and I said, "I have never been so humiliated in my life. I'm not going to wear it again. I will never wear it again." He said, "Calm down. It's the law. You have to do what the law says." I said, "I don't care. I will never wear it again." I got humiliated. He spat into my face. Never, never again. My father finally realized that I meant what I said, and he spent half his savings buying me false identity papers. So now my name was Aranka Molnar, and I went to live on this farm, and I lived with a client, well, the owner of the farm was a very grateful patient of my grandfather's who never charged him.
Let me go back and ask, you said it was about the time that that Jews were being picked up and moved into the ghetto, or ordered to go into the ghetto. Did that happen to your parents, even though you were on the farm?
It didn't happen to my parents because my father was a highly decorated military exception.
I see.
The German Iron Cross saved him.
Hmm.
And the medals, take a look at them in Nigel's home. He has them all framed.
So even as a Jew, the
That-
Iron Cross was enough to keep.
That was at that time. Later on, I don't think it would have.
It was just he and his wife, though. The protection didn't go any further.
Yeah, it didn't. So he spent his entire savings buying me false identity papers and my brother too.
So you stayed on the farm for how long?
I stayed on the farm for about a year and a half, and as I said, I milked the goat every day and I fed the pigs, and the planes, the Allied planes, that's you guys would come by and drop the bombs, and I would go out into the yard and look up at the sky and watch the planes, and I would quietly talk to them and say, come on, kill everybody, wipe out this country, they don't deserve to be around, they're so cruel, they don't deserve to be around.
You were a pretty angry young
I was
girl.
angry and I was talking to the sky,
Mhm.
to the planes, and
Did you know, or did anybody hint at what was going on, the camps and the other kinds of things that had really begun?
not at that time, because I was not in contact with anybody Jewish.
Mhm.
I was living
Mhm.
with a 100% Catholic family
Mhm.
who could prove their pure Aryan ancestry going back 4 generations. That's what you have to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
4 generations. But I was very careful not to run into people, not to meet anybody. As I said, I spent my life taking care of the pig and the goat.
What happened after that when you left the farm?
Well, as time went by and more bombings took place, I didn't feel comfortable anymore staying there. And they had relatives from the country coming too to stay with them who were asking questions about me. So from one day to the next, I disappeared, and I went home to rejoin my parents.
Wow. Sounds
And
very dangerous.
it was dangerous. I hid in the apartment. We had an apartment on the 2nd floor with a balcony, and I hid inside. But at night, I would go out to the balcony and look across the street where my one-time elementary school was, and look into the window of the classroom I used to attend.
You weren't going to school during these years.
I didn't go to school. I missed, well, most of the people who grew up during World War II, they missed 4 to 6 years of education. And the country didn't want to have a bunch of kids blocking the system who were delayed and had to get education. So they arranged a short course and exams that people could take
I see.
in order to move up to the classroom that they would be attending. And I did that,
Mhm.
and I took the tests and I passed, and I got into college right away.
Was your brother still at home, or had he really?
Well,
gone into
my brother also had false identity papers my father bought him, and he got a job working for the police, and he lived in an apartment with an Aryan identity, and this is difficult to talk to. And at the end of the war, he went through so much stress, he committed suicide. And my family never got over that. And it's been more than 70 years, and I have nightmares now about it. So let's not discuss it.
Were there problems getting enough food during that time?
Oh, yes. We were starving, and literally starving, because when the bombs dropped 4 times a day, and that's what you guys did to us. You know, you sent the planes and dropped bombs. There wasn't one store left in a city with 1 million people that had its windows that wasn't cleaned out of all food and everything. Every store was robbed clean. There was no food that you could buy any place. So we had horse-drawn carts those days. And I was a survivor. I used to run out into the street in between bombings, and I would cut a chunk off a dead, rotting horse's butt and put it into a bucket and fill the bucket with snow and take it to my mother and say triumphantly, "Look, Ma, I brought you some snow to boil the horse meat, and now we're going to eat meat." And that's all we had for a while. And then I realized that my one-time elementary school, which was right across the street, had a soup kitchen in the basement. They used to provide meals for the poor children, and the people from my building who were all living in the cellar, because the bombs were dropping, that was the only way you could survive. They decided to charge over and tear open the kitchen in the basement and see what food they could find. And I didn't break into the place, but I attached myself to the back of the troop and I went in with them. And I hid while they robbed the place clean. And when they finished, I stuck around, and I noticed there were a couple of plastic bags on top of a very high cabinet in one of the rooms in the cellar. So I put a stool there, and then I put a chair on top of the stool, and I climbed up and I grabbed those bags. And they were filled with mildewed, dried, shredded carrots and mildewed, dried, shredded cabbage. And I triumphantly took them home and said to my mother, "Look, Ma, we can eat something other than the horse meat. Look what I brought you." And my father came into the room. He was a lawyer, president of the Bar Association. And he said, "Where'd you get that?" So I said, "Oh, my one-time elementary school in the soup kitchen." He said, "Surely you don't think I'm going to eat that? What? My daughter has stolen food? I don't eat stolen food." And I was beside myself. I started to cry. I said to my mother, "My father hates me. He won't forgive me for this." And she said, "Don't give it another thought. In 3 days from now, when he's really hungry, I will boil the dried mildewed vegetables. I will sprinkle some spices on them, and he will be so hungry he will eat them without recognizing them." She was right. But he disapproved of me. I got that a lot, you know. I was a survivor, and when my grandparents came back from the country to their apartment, as I told you, there wasn't one window left in Budapest, which had 1 million people, because the constant airstrikes broke every window.
How did your parents feel safe enough to come back to the city?
Well, they were in the city,
And
but they were
grandparents.
living in the
Grandparents, I'm
cellar
sorry,
below.
I meant to say grandparents, who had been on the farm?
Well, my grandparents finally came back, and I prepared their apartment for them. And I did something unforgivable and inexcusable. I went looking in their apartment for something that I could fill the windows with because it was freezing cold in February. And I found my grandfather was a surgeon, and he had a big closet that was filled with x-rays. And the x-rays were 16 by 32. That would be this big. And those days, the emulsion that they used was different from what they use today. You'd never be able to do this today. But I took those x-rays and I put them in the bathtub, and I filled the bathtub with boiling water, and the emulsion floated to the top. And then I rubbed them clean with a towel, put them together with duct tape, and taped them into the empty window.
How clever is that?
Well, I was a survivor.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, when you live through a period like that, it has that effect on you. You're going to crack your lens.
Not at all.
So your grandparents, when they came back, and your parents, were they
Let me tell you
harassed?
this, my grandparents came back, and I wanted to surprise them, and I taped the clear x-ray films into their windows so their place wouldn't be so freezing
Yeah,
cold.
That's great.
And my grandfather came in and he looked at the windows and they said, "What's that? Where'd you get that from?" So I said, "Oh, Grandpa, I took some of those sheets that were piled in your closet and I cleared them and taped them together." He said, "You did what?" "Those were my patients' records. I am responsible for their health and well-being. You had no right to do that." I went to my mother crying. I said, "Grandpa hates me, he won't forgive me. I did something inexcusable." And she said, "Don't give it another thought. He had his say, just like your father had his say about the dried mildewed vegetables that you took from the school. And when he is cold and hungry enough, he'll forget all about it." She was right.
So the bombings had continued, and then the war turned. The Germans now were losing.
The
How did that
Germans
affect-
were losing, and the Soviet soldiers came in, and I was hoping and praying for them. And guess what? They came into our cellar with their arms aimed at us, the people, civilians, and they yelled first, "Chas, chas, koko, chas." Speak any Russian? That means watches, watches. Where are your watches?
Ah,
They confiscated everybody's watches at gunpoint. My grandmother had 2 watches on her arms. One was gold, the other silver. They took both. My mother's watches, everybody's. Because in Russia, that being a communist country, they didn't waste money on useless items like watches because they had public service announcing the time on the clocks, and they had clocks on every corner, and the radio announced the time. So watches were considered an unnecessary luxury item. They could sell them for a lot of money. So they came with their guns aimed at us, confiscated everybody's watches, and then they pulled up their sleeves laughing. They had watches from here to there on both arms. Russian soldiers. Then they yelled, "Barishnya, barishnya." You know what that means? It's a young girl. And I'm sorry to say they raped 3 of them in our building.
wow.
One of them was the superintendent's daughter. She was 16 years old, and they ordered her to go upstairs looking for a couch. And she said, "Are you crazy? I'm not going with you." And they said, oh no, you're going to do as we tell you. And they turned to the rest of us sitting there, aimed their guns at us, and said, show me her parents, point them out. Somebody right away pointed out her parents. They went up to her mother, shoved the gun into the mother's mouth, and said, you come with us or she's going to be dead in 1 minute, I'm counting. She right away went up with them. 3 of them raped her. They brought her down unconscious and bleeding, threw her on the ground in front of her bare parents, and she became a nun because she didn't ever want to have anything to do with a guy again after that experience. I'm sorry, I have
It happened.
unpleasant
Yeah.
memories.
Yeah.
Now, my mother was very helpful to me, and she realized what was going to happen, and I had hair down to here, and she cut it off completely, and she put one of my brother's baseball hats on my head, and she made me wear my brother's clothes.
How old were you at this point?
I was 11 or 12, and I started to develop already as a girl. But when the starvation started, you're probably not aware of this, all women stopped having periods because they couldn't spare the blood to waste. So no child was born for a year and a half after that time period, because anybody who had sex or was raped would not conceive, which was a good thing under the circumstances. You know, that the women who were raped all the time didn't conceive.
Take out
But yeah,
So the Soviet troops were brutal.
the Soviet troops were brutal. They Barishnya, they dragged them up at
But did things change for the city though, once the war seemed to have shifted?
yeah, well, the war shifted, but the communists were in charge, and everything was according to the way, you know, they demanded, they ordered, and we didn't get back to having proper food and nourishment for a long time, over a year. I kept going out into the street, cutting chunks of dead horses and filling a bucket with snow and giving it to my mother, saying, I brought you snow to cook the food in. And
But then you at some point left Hungary.
yeah, I was hungry.
Or left the
I
country.
started to tell you,
Yeah.
I lost 30 pounds and I flattened out completely.
Yeah.
So when my mother put my brother's clothes on me, I looked like a boy. She cut my hair off too. I had hair down to here. I could sit on it. Not anymore.
How did you come to leave your country then?
Well, when the war was over, I had an uncle in the United States, Dr. Stephen Rosenack, the inventor of the first artificial kidney. Yes, he was a very outstanding surgeon, and he came back immediately to bring antibiotics for his parents and to supervise his father's upcoming surgery. My grandfather needed prostate surgery, and we didn't have antibiotics in Europe at all. So my uncle came to, he wasn't going to operate on his father, but he was going to supervise it and supply the antibiotics.
I see.
And he did that, and while he was there, I took him for a walk through bombed out Budapest, Hungary, and by the way, did I show you the picture? Yeah, I did.
Oh, yeah.
I lived behind that building.
Right.
I took him for a walk, and he said to me, you seem awfully depressed. Is there anything I can do for you? And I said, get me out of this hellhole. I hate everybody. I don't trust anybody. I don't trust my neighbors. I don't trust my one-time classmates. I don't trust anybody because people turn each other in.
Mm.
People who were your friends and neighbors before, they turn their best friends, co-workers in to the Nazis and then to the Soviets. I don't want to live here.
Mm-hmm.
He said, how am I going to do that? You know, you already put your name on the American immigration quota, and you were told there's a 15-year waiting period.
Really?
So I said, I know that, but you'll be traveling through England to visit your sister-in-law. He married an English woman and took her to the States. And while you're in London, I want you to enroll me at London University. And I gave him an authorized translation of my birth certificate and my graduation certificate. And with those, he did enroll me at London University. And a few months later, I applied for a passport and a student visa, and they let me leave with a student visa.
Amazing.
Then while I was in London, the Hungarian government changed to totally communist, and they slammed down on immigration and visas, and they ordered me to return home, which I refused. So they sent me a letter saying if I ever returned to Hungary because I didn't obey the law, I would be arrested. And I ignored that, and I stayed in London, and I fell in love with the British way of life, and I never wanted to leave there. And then, much to my surprise, the American visa came through after 5 years in London, because all the people who were ahead of me on the immigration visa couldn't leave Hungary with the communist government. So those who were abroad,
Yeah.
they were suddenly available.
Yeah.
And the British government, they kicked me out. They said, we allowed you to stay with a student visa so you wouldn't lose your opportunity to immigrate to the US because you were waiting for a visa number. Now that it came through, kindly leave the UK, the United Kingdom, or you would prove that you came to our country under false pretenses. Fair play, old chap. You know, that's the British. So I got onto the Queen Mary and I cried, and I was the last one to get off the Queen Mary, because as long as I was on the Queen Mary, I was still in England, I felt. And my poor uncle, the doctor, you know, he was marching up and down on the pier thinking something terrible happened to me. I still feel guilty about that, because I was the last one to get off the boat.
Ah.
Yeah.
So you began a new life in the States.
I had a new life in
How old
this.
were you when you finally came here?
21.
21.
21. Yeah, I left for England at 15. I stayed there for 5 years, and then I finally made it to the US at 2021. And while I was in England, I took courses in color photography, and I worked for Technicolor, and I ran an outfit called Technicolor there. So when I came to this country, I right away had a job working for Technicolor,
Mm-hmm.
and I used to work for Technicolor, and the big museums would send $1 million insured paintings to Technicolor to make copies of that matched exactly in hue and contrast.
Interesting.
It was interesting. I loved doing that.
How did you meet your husband?
Well, I met him in England. When I lived in England, I lived in a boarding house. And he had a room in the same boarding house above mine. And the boarding house included breakfast, so we sat together at breakfast. And he was very kind to me. I was new in London, and I was struggling with the English
Mhm.
language, and he took me around London to show me around, and then he took me up to Scotland. He really showed me around
Mhm.
and educated me, so to speak, and helped me with my English, with my pronunciation, and how to write difficult letters. We even went so far as to tour France together. And then my American visa number came through, and we said goodbye. He sold me off to the boat, and I got on the Queen Mary. And 3 months after I arrived here, I had a long distance call from England, and it was my boyfriend, and he said, you said that once you settled in I could come and visit. So I said, well, that's up to you, but don't tell your family that you do that because of me, because they'll hate me for life. You know, if I took you away from them in England.
Was
So,
he Jewish? Did he
yeah.
know that you were Jewish?
Yeah, he knew, but not right away. Took him a while to find out. To tell you the truth, I kept that covered up.
Hmm.
When you wore a Moga David and had somebody spit in your face, you don't want to brag about that. And also, I don't think I told you that, but I was in London at a synagogue once, attending a Friday night service, and it wasn't in London, it was in Manhattan,
Mhm.
and 2 terrorist bombs exploded in the synagogue.
Wasn't
Where was
that,
it?
that was when you were with your grandfather in Budapest?
It was in Budapest.
Yeah, you
still?
were much younger, that's when it happened.
Okay, it was in
Sorry.
Budapest. 2 terrorist bombs exploded, and my grandmother and I were sitting together, and the ceiling caved in, the lights went out. There was a horrible stench of, burning air, and the ceiling started to fall in. I was covered with grit, and everybody was trying to run out. And one of the worst experiences of my life was to watch this, because people who were praying before, talking to God, all of a sudden they were afraid of dying within seconds. And when you're afraid of dying, the only thing that matters is to take another breath of air and to live a minute longer.
Mhm.
And people were knocking each other down, stepping on the old people, pushing the children down onto the floor and stepping on them. Nothing mattered except getting out and taking one more breath of air. I vowed I'd never go back to synagogue again after that.
I understand.
I did go back though when Nigel's younger brother got married at the synagogue. He married a Jewish girl. That was the first and I think only time.
Nigel said that you actually changed your religion.
Yeah, I did. Now, don't put this in an article. This is private and personal. But there's nothing wrong with the Jewish religion. It's perfectly plausible. It's perhaps the most sensible, easiest to accept religion there is. But there is so much humiliation with it. If you had somebody spit in your face before, you don't want to continue being exposed to that. So, I became Presbyterian. I got married in a Presbyterian ceremony. I raised my children Presbyterian, and I'm now Presbyterian.
You know, I think the trauma of war and the things you experienced just for being born a girl of Jewish descent, and how it's made you feel, I think that's really important to tell.
Well-
And that you made a decision to go a different way. I would like to say that if you let me.
Not against it. Okay, but I don't, to this day, usually tell people about my Jewish
Of course,
heritage.
this whole article is kind of about that.
Where is it going to be published?
In the newspaper,
Which one?
The Democrat.
It's okay, Mom. You're gonna help a lot of people understand.